Good morning and welcome to the Science, Conservation and Humanities Seminar. Every year, our Andrew W. Mellon Fellows provide us with a report on their research progress, and I'm, as their boss, running the Humanities Institute here at the New York Botanical Garden, find it a really great pleasure to introduce this year's crop. Two Mellon Research Fellows who really stand out not only because they make sense, but also because they have a great sense of humor. They're Nuala Griffin and Camden Burt. They excel at using the garden's historical collections and have gathered plant science, conservation, and other experts from all departments around them to help them resolve the questions they have come here in the Botanical Garden to resolve. Camden Burt, who will be the first to speak, holds a PhD in the history from the University of Rochester. During his time here, he is working on a manuscript, a book manuscript, tentatively titled Planting an Empire, Nurserymen and the Making of the American Landscape. His research explores the interaction of nature, business, and the whole culture of 19th century America through the examination of plant nurserymen. And he is looking at our 58,000 plus trade and seed catalogs, which are unique that we have that complete collection. He told me he has already looked at 13,456 of them, so he's still a while to go, and we hope you will make it before your tenure ends here. Yeah. Please help me in welcoming Camden.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa, and thank you all for coming here on this gloomy day. Yeah, I've got a lot of catalogs to look through, and I've looked through quite a bit. I've been here for about 2 months now. And actually, I'm going to split up my talk today, giving you an overview of how I've come to the gardens, what I was doing before I came here, and then at the end, I'll give a little bit of time to just give an overview of what I've accomplished in the past 2 months and where I hope to be going in the remainder of my time. It's been truly amazing to work in this beautiful environment. Just to walk in is great. And I will just say that the staff here at this library is incredibly friendly, which is not always the case at libraries, and warm, and in addition to being helpful with the research, are just generally great at sort of adding levity to an otherwise sometimes monotonous research process, especially with 58,000 plant catalogs. So it's been great to work here. But to begin this talk, I am interested in 19th century America and the intersection of culture, capitalism, and the environment. And there should be no, perhaps the most interesting topic of which I probably don't need to explain to you all because you are plant people like me, plant nurserymen, which are rarely understood as a historical subject. We actually make for a great nexus of this topic. But to get started, I need you to leave the beauty of the New York Botanical Gardens and go to some place that was definitively not beautiful in the 19th century, and that's Rochester in the 1830s. Rochester, New York was a quintessential Erie Canal city. The population was about 4,000 in 1825 when the Erie Canal opened up. 5 years later, it was about 10,000. And by 1838, it was 20,000 residents living in Rochester, New York. This was considered to be the first boom town in America. The chief growth of the city, in addition to its connection to the Erie Canal, which you can kind of see briefly, comes in from the southeast, actually goes through the heart of the city, passes over the Genesee River via aqueduct, and heads west towards Buffalo. But the chief growth was the massive waterfalls that actually sat at the center of the city, which provided necessary water power to power the flour mills, which lined the gulf of the waterfall rim. At its peak, there was roughly 25 flour mills running daily, and because of the necessary need for wheat and other grains, the surrounding countryside was almost exclusively devoted to one crop, and that was wheat and other grains that could be quickly sold to market at very high profit. Now, this was a boom economy in Rochester. Times were good. Flour millers were making a lot of money. Wheat farmers were making a lot of money. Though they were making a lot of money. There was no question that Rochester was an ugly place. And just to give you an example of some people who had ideas about Rochester, Nathaniel Hawthorne, when he traveled through the city in the 1830s, claimed that the city appeared to have sprung up like a mushroom. When Frances Trollope, if anyone's read her Domestic Manners of America, which is just an incredibly funny read for its critique of Americans, she passed through on the Erie Canal, and she described Rochester as the product of a Jack and Beanstalk principle, where the stumps of the forest were still to be found firmly rooted in cellars. Other passerbys called Rochester, quote, a dirty place with no great beauty. It was a city filled with, quote, filled with mud and rubbish, with only a few houses which could be called handsome. So though the economy was good, no one had anything nice to say about Rochester as far as its beautiful appeal. That would only hurt more after the Panic of 1837, which for a variety of reasons, which was restrictions in lending from British banks, complete fallout of cotton prices in the South. Banks in America no longer recognized the banknotes that they were passing around. So this led to what is considered to be America's first major economic recession. This especially hurt a place like Rochester, which needed a thriving economy to work. In fact, the inflated markets were a sign of the good times, which proved to be disastrous for people who lived in Rochester during this time period. Of the reported proceedings that we know, 1838 and 1839, over 300 homes were auctioned away on foreclosure for little profits. And even more interesting, from 1838 to 1844, 60% of the city's population left. 60%. And what's even more interesting about that number is that the city population stayed the same, meaning that people were moving through Rochester. This was an incredibly restless place where no one stayed. You probably didn't know your neighbor. You definitely didn't own your house. And you were passing in before going further west to hopefully make it big on a farm in Michigan, Ohio, or Indiana, where land was much cheaper than the inflated prices that were in the western New York region at that time period. So it was an anxious place, it was a dirty place, and it wasn't even an economically strong place in the wake of the Panic of 1837. But there was one spot in the city where you could go to get away, and that was the Mount Hope Botanical and Pomological Garden, also known as the Mount Hope Nursery, which was founded in 1840 by two immigrants, George Ellwanger, who was from Germany. He had arrived in America just a few years prior, before settling in Rochester. He was professionally trained as a horticulturalist. Patrick Barry, who had come to America about a decade earlier, he worked for the William Prince Nursery in Flushing, New York, actually, before picking up and leaving to go try his luck out west after that nursery had struggles after the Panic of 1837. They formed their partnership in 1840 on a small 7-acre plot on the southern edge of the city. As you can see, they have a very idealized vision of what their nursery looked like in this time period. I think this is about from 1845. But it was noted that this was probably the one place in the city where you could get away from wandering livestock in the streets of Rochester. They actually dedicated a small portion of their land to be almost sort of like a public park garden where you were encouraged to just walk around and enjoy the beautiful landscape that they had cultivated there themselves. But they also had a vision in the Panic of 1837 because they were also anxious about the new realities of this world that they lived in. And they believed that everyone should turn to horticulture. This would be the answer to solve America's woes. And they had a few reasons why they believed horticulture was important for Americans in the 19th century. First, most obviously, it added beauty to the landscape. In a place that clearly was noted for its stumps everywhere, they thought maybe we could plant a few trees. This might be a more desirable place for people to come and visit, and you might find it more beautiful. They actually believed the action, doing horticulture, partaking in this, had deeply moralizing benefits. Now, it's tough to grapple with how it must have felt to be in early 19th century America, but this is the rise of major cities, which were almost unprecedented in America at the time. They were very anxious on what they believed to be modern society. The rise of what they would have called catch-a-penny movements, circuses, brothels, taverns, things that would have been wasteful to not only your pocketbook, but things that would ruin the integrity of a human being. They said, if you focus on your garden, you don't have time for these activities, and in fact, you'll save your soul. And they often framed in very religious terms. They also believe horticulture gave a sense of rootedness to its practitioner. And the logic makes sense. If you were to plant a tree, let's say a fruit tree, you would be invested in seeing that tree come to fruition. You would at least take a few years, hopefully, for that sapling to start growing fruit. And therefore, that tree would be something to your landscape that would add meaning and value to why you feel like you are connected to this place. And lastly, it's a reliable source of income. They believe that if you just, for all farmers, if you just gave yourself a little bit of land and planted a small orchard, this would help supplement the hard times, which is to say, if you have an orchard, apples which are increasingly more marketable in major cities, this could be a source of profit for you where you don't actually have to replenish seed every year. So it had practical uses as well. Now, this is a message that is particularly important in a place like Rochester, New York, which seemed to be exemplifying the worst characteristics of antebellum America in this time period. But they quickly realized that this was not a message they only had to keep in Rochester. Like, they thought all Americans could benefit from their horticultural message, and that's because nurserymen held a very unique place during this time period. And where did they get this idea? Well, from Andrew Jackson Downing, who, in his Horticulturalist, often gave time to talk about how important nurserymen were to reforming Americans and the American landscape. In addition to being expected to be the experts of how a local landscape was to be planted, what was the weather like, what was the soil like, they were the local experts for the environment when people would move into regions. Plant nurserymen were also considered to be cultivators of taste. Andrew Jackson Downing, in this piece that I have just the cover of, which I believe is called How to Popularize the Taste for Planting, he actually advanced a set of expectations. He called upon nurserymen to cultivate a desire for planting, quote, which gives to every beloved home in the country its greatest outward charm, and the country itself its highest attraction. He encouraged nurserymen to leave their grounds, talk to residents, and carry samples of whatever they had on their grounds, whether it was honeysuckle, roses, peonies, beautiful specimens, apple trees, whatever they had, even encouraging them at times to give it away for free. And he believed the goal was simple for him, quote, encourage men to plant at any and all rates. Downing was telling nurserymen to be evangelists for horticulture. It's no surprise then that Patrick Barry, and it's a blurry image, and I do have the original book out on display. Patrick Barry heeded this message, and in 1851 published his The Fruit Garden, a treatise. He definitely embraced that message, and in the opening pages wrote, fruit culture, therefore, whether considered a branch of profitable industry or as exercising a most beneficial influence upon the health, habits, and tastes of the people, becomes a great national interest. He went even further to say, fortunately, in the United States, land is so easily obtained as to be within the reach of every industrious man, and the climate and the soil being so favorable to the production of fruit, Americans, if they not be already, must become truly a nation of fruit growers. And this is, just to step back for a second, this is the significance of what I would say is why plant nourishment grow to be as influential as they are, because we also have to contextualize these comments during an era of American imperialism, which I think sometimes we too often associate with soldiers and armies. But if we think about how land is cleared and how settlers move into those cleared lands, they need plant material to make a reasonable homestead and farmstead. And so I want us to think a little bit about, instead of thinking about armies and soldiers as forces of empire, have we thought about the insidious nature of an apple tree? Okay? So with this message in mind, the nursery set out to reform the American landscape. Within 20 years, by 1860, this is an overview of their grounds, they had expanded from 7 acres of land to nearly 600 acres of nursery, making it not only the largest nursery in America, but the largest nursery in the world. And that's about roughly 3 times the size of the New York Botanical Garden, which is quite impressive. They had a large packing shed at the center of the nursery where orders would come in. They would quickly run out to the nursery grounds, which were neatly arranged by plants, by variety. They would grab them from the field, bring them back to the packing shed, put them in boxes, maybe pack it with moss, because hopefully they won't dry out in the shipment, and send them out. Now, in the peak seasons, they would employ somewhere of 250 employees to do this work during this time period, during the planting seasons. Here's a more modern picture. Actually, this is from turn of the century, as the nursery is actually coming down in their trade. But just to give you a sense, I love this image because you just see these saplings just stacked up and bundled together right before they're about to ship out. And presumably, someone's looking at some orders there on the left side, just to give you some visualizations of how this trade worked. They hired traveling salesmen. And these are some pictures of some specimen books, which we have a few out, of which the nursery would essentially reach out to lithograph publishers who were producing these specialized and say, this is what we have in our nursery. Will you please compile this book? That they would give to traveling salesmen who were essentially knocking door to door, asking if people were interested in specific varieties that were well-suited or at least being carried at the nursery themselves. And so you can just skim through, and they have different varieties of trees, of apples that you could pick and say, yes, I'll take 500 of those. And then the order would go in, and the nursery would send it out. And of course, they use catalogs, which I've become very familiar with during my time here. But these come into their own in the middle of the 19th century and really become an art form by the late 19th century as a form of advertising. But the technology hasn't changed on these still. You still get catalogs, and you can still write what you want and send it back in, and they'll ship it to you. And this is the formative period of that as well. And this one is also on display. I was not lucky to get a lot of written materials when I was studying this specific plant nursery for my dissertation. But what I did have were business ledgers, which I thought, okay, like these are incredibly boring to read, but otherwise, how can we use these to actually get a sense of how this business operated over time? And thanks to digital technologies today, which allow historians more skilled than they ever were trained to do, we can transfer this and visualize how this trade worked. So just to give you a sense, I mean, this is a typical page from one of their ledgers. You can see at the top we have a name. To the right of their name is the location of the sale, and underneath we actually have the amount of sale, which at least gives us a sense of how much plant material they're buying. It does not tell us what plants they're buying, but it gives us a sense of how much plant material they're buying during this time period. We put those into databases, and then we can map them, and we start to see a footprint of the nursery over time. So this is 1845. The nursery's only been around for 5 years, still not to its behemoth size. It's not surprising that most of the sales are coming from the nearby Rochester region. It is still a local nursery at this time period, though by 1845, they actually help establish a sister company in Toronto, Ontario, recognizing the growing population in that region as well, which is its second largest sales point. I don't know how everyone's geography is, but all those sprinkling dots there basically hover around the Erie Canal across the state as well. So they are utilizing the transportation networks that are available to them. The prices down below here are in 19th century terms. So the largest sale region would be about $3,000 in Rochester. Just to give you a sense, a standard apple sapling would go for about 6 cents, and a more exotic variety would be maybe $1, $1.50. So they're moving quite a bit of plant material even in this early time. 10 years later, we've expanded rapidly out west into those regions that are quickly growing into the fastest growing regions in North America during the middle of the 19th century, which is the American Midwest. And again, the prices start to go up. By this time, they're utilizing the Great Lakes shipping network, but they are also starting to utilize railways, which are also becoming more and more common during this time period. If we jump ahead a few decades to 1885, again, we continue expanding westward, and then by 1895, this is not weighted, this is just a simple footprint of their sales. They are coast to coast, they are selling in Canada, and they are also selling in Mexico. And off the map, they are also selling in Europe as well. I think the map says 1,154 unique destinations by 1895, in 1895, that's just 1 year. So the company has expanded a great deal during this time period. And this is part of the research I've been doing to sort of get a sense of how the business moved and the creation of this 19th century plant trade during this time period. So I want to pivot to what I've been working on. So I have this footprint, this economic footprint, but I wanted to get a sense of actual plants, and I have catalogs for that. I have so many catalogs for that. I've got rows and rows and boxes and boxes. This is just to give you a sense. I think there's like 4 rows like this. So I've been busy. I think Vanessa is giving me a lot of credit with the early numbers. I appreciate that. 13,000, that's what I've done. No. And I'm just interested in tracking a few specific plant varieties that I know were significant in 19th century. For example, this I just saw the other day when I was at Union Square Market, the Northern Spy. I know that the Northern Spy, as a cultivar, originated, they found it on a random farm outside of Rochester, New York. It was considered a very popular plant variety because it's a winter variety, which means it grows late and it can be picked late, but it also stored very well. Patrick Berry, in his fruit garden book, which is, again, on display, says that if it's picked and stored correctly, you can sell it as late as July of the following season. Now, that's incredible for an apple, but also incredible if you're trying to sell apples, because if you can store an apple to, say, late winter or early spring when there are no apples on the market, that can be an incredibly lucrative apple variety for you. And so what I've been trying to do is, as I go through catalogs, notice which nurseries are selling a Northern Spy. So I've been doing a lot of searching in catalogs. And here you go. This is a nursery out of Southeast Michigan in Detroit. And before I keep going, I just want to note how beautiful these objects are, because not only is this a catalog, which is a record of that business, but this is someone who presumably took the catalog and started marking it up to decide what they were going to order that year. They've started identifying certain plants. You can see they're doing some math up here on the back page. So they're doing the mental math in their head, saying, okay, what's my order going to be when I order from the Monroe Nursery outside of Detroit this year? But this nursery in 1869 has the Northern Spy. Okay, so we know it's at least gotten to Michigan by 1869. It's also in Connecticut in 1869. So it's moving. It's moving east too. We can find it in Richmond, Indiana a few years later in 1874. And in Ohio, 1888. So this has been my work, is essentially picking popular plants and giving us a sense of how those plants are moving and how people are talking about those plants. I will also be having a map of these plants, but as you know, I have to get more into my database before I can post that. But that's what I'm working on. And I'm actually interested in a lot of your questions and comments after Nuala's talk, I presume. But because I'll be interested, I still have 7 months here and I have a lot of catalogs to get through. But I'm curious if anyone has questions, comments, suggestions, or any helpers to look through these catalogs. But that is my research topic, and I'm excited to hear comments and questions afterwards. Thank you. It's the one obviously named me.
Yeah, the one named Camden.
Thank you, Camden. That was wonderful. The Northern Spy is such a nice tart apple, perfect for this time of year to make your apple pies. Our second speaker is Nuala Griffin, who is a PhD candidate at NYU and a research associate of the American Museum of Natural History. Her dissertation, entitled The Unfinished Synthesis, The Rise of Phylogenetics in an Age of Climate Change, 1880-1990, examines the intellectual and the political conflict waged by two bodies of scientific knowledge, namely ecology and evolutionary phylogenetics, and all that in a place called Madagascar. A process she is looking at that laid the foundation for today's conservation management in the face of climate change. And her talk has an interesting title. I cannot buy all of your taxonomic conclusions, and we will see what she means by that. Thank you.
Hi. Oh wow, when you're sitting up the front, you don't realize there's so many people here. Can you hear me? Yes. Awesome. Maybe a little down. Okay. I don't know if you can still hear me now.
Yes, you can.
Yeah? Okay, cool. So obviously it's like wonderful that y'all came out. This is like brilliant. And I'm going to start just by thanking, because I know it'll get lost when we move into the question, like to thank Vanessa. And the Institute, the Humanities Institute here is just has been incredible. It's been such an opportunity and such a privilege. And obviously the Mertz Library community here is just outstanding. I second everything you say, Camden, about them. They're so much fun. They're super creative and dynamic, and it's like, yay, so thank you. Right, so unlike Camden, where Camden is his project, I'm about 10 months into this project. And so I was contemplating like what direction to actually take for this talk. So I decided that you're gonna travel with me, in essence, through my brain and out the other side. Are you ready, Brian? We're gonna go through space and time, and you'll see why, and sort of follow me through some of the puzzles that I'm trying to actually work through and see where we land. I can promise you it's gonna get rocky. It's definitely, I can promise that. It's gonna get obscure and abstract. It might even get a little queer. We'll see where we go, see how the audience reacts. And definitely it's gonna get a bit racy. It's botanical science, you all know this, right? We know this already better. So I do have, if I do get to show you some pictures at the very end, I do have a content warning. Some of them are a little bit racy. So I'll let you know so you can disengage. So I actually came to this project because of my deep fascination with models. If I can make this work.
Is it on? Yep.
Yeah. All right. So not these kind of models, obviously, or maybe. We'll see where this goes. But they do kind of get at how models operate. Models are ideal representations of an object or a process or even a person. For example, an ideal body or pose or hair. Fabio looks amazing. A scientist, I'll just direct you to Rachel Carson. A superhero, and even a historian. You can see. So all of these images represent implicit cultural values that are not explicitly explained to the viewer. What they do is they subsume the mechanics of how these values actually emerged. Models hide data because that's the very nature of them, and there's a history to them. But as Vanessa said, the models I'm curious about are not as delicious as some of these ones. Well, they're delicious to me, and I know there's some people in the audience. Are you ready, Brian? You're going to get excited about this one. I'm interested in ecological and evolutionary models. A little bit different. They don't have as much hair. They might by the end of this talk. My project, what I'm really interested in is conservation biology across the globe. And I'm interested in the recent arguments in shifting from using ecology or ecological models and that kind of data, and I'll explain this in a second, and the swing into using phylogenetics as a tool in conservation. So let's think about this. Is everyone here with me, or are you still thinking about one of those models? Like Aquaman, right? I don't expect you to read this. This is just to give you a sense of where we're going with this. Ecologists, this is very, very crude categorization. Ecologists themselves are interested in things called ecosystems or ecoregions. So for them, nature is a sort of vision of organisms together with their environment. And so for them, species, place, and space are intricately linked. They can't be separated. So conservation would end up being protecting large swaths of landscape, right? So conservation parks, national parks. But what I'm interested in is since the 1990s, there's a change into using evolutionary trees as a tool, and I want to know what's going to happen when you apply that to the same species, if this will go forward. If nature, to an evolutionary biologist, and this is particularly to systematists, if nature is alternately a series of genetic lineages on an evolutionary tree, then species are historical artifacts of deep time. Protection then involves choosing candidate organisms. This data I won't be able to talk about today, but maybe in the questions and answers I will, based on the value of high genetic diversity. And then you create a conservation area around their lifestyles, whether it's in that place or not. So location, in theory, is not as significant as the position of the organism on the tree. On the surface, this seems merely a methodological problem for how conservationists assign value to species, but the immediacy with which evolutionary thinking has landed on conservationist lips belies a deeper intellectual and political history. The practice of systematics as a modern science, as you know, or I hope you'll know, emerges from and is intimately bound to a longer history of colonial and post-colonial collecting practices and value systems on how to interpret nature. With the launch in 2007 of the Evolutionary Distinct and Globally Endangered, or EDGE program, onto the zoological world, I'm interested in the legal status of plants. What happens to plants legally is becoming more and more ambiguous, especially in this age of climate change. So my project, it's quite unwieldy, aims to understand this sticky entanglement of these two bodies of knowledge and to try and understand what led to the shift, to the rise of phylogenetics and conservation science and the impact it has on the ground. So to get under this huge question, I used the island of Madagascar as a case study to track how these scientific knowledge systems interact with local Malagasy knowledge systems. So my guiding questions broadly are, what exactly are we saving, for whom, and who actually gets to decide? So why did I choose Madagascar, other than the fact I want to go there? If you put in Madagascar into a search engine, you'll find that one of the first things that comes up is its biodiversity. It's probably the one thing we kind of relate most to it about. It's currently designated as one of the world's highest priority countries for biodiversity conservation due to its exceptional species richness, including many important crops such as vanilla, rice, and sweet potatoes. And we have some kind of vanilla bits and bobs to show you over here. It's also important because it's an island, and islands are theoretically important for ecologists and evolution biologists to understand biological processes due to its long isolation from the mainland. The other reason I'm interested in is Madagascar is one of the poorest places on the globe, and in age of climate change, it has been consistently ranked as one of the top 10 most vulnerable nations. The biological bias of Madagascar polarizes this human-nature dichotomy by placing biodiversity on one side and then abject poverty of the population on the other as the ultimate driver of threats to biodiversity. But obviously they are linked. And so this is the space that I'm trying to work through at the moment. I don't expect you to read this, but you'll have seen this before. The time is running out. So this is a big question I'm trying to figure out. So Madagascar, just like Aquaman. Who likes Aquaman? No one? Are you the only person you love Aquaman? Madagascar is something that we all probably have a sense of it, even if we've never been there. So this story that I'm going to bring you on today begins in 1874. We're going to begin somewhere in the forests of Madagascar. Doesn't matter where. A German botanist named Karl Lesch and his companion, Hendrik, and a party of cave-dwelling Makoto tribes people are hacking their way through the dense jungle. Are we all there in the dense jungle together? Okay, cool. I hope someone brought an EpiPen. We may need it. At the bend in a muddy creek, they come across this remarkable sight. It's an 8-foot-tall pineapple-looking tree with thorny leaves. Its 12-foot-long leaves are they're huge. And it's surrounded by this depression that's full of this sort of sweet liquid. From the top of the tree sprout these long, hairy green tendrils. They're constantly and vigorously in motion with a subtle, sinuous, silent throbbing against the air. Chanting, the Makoto single out one of their women. They force her at javelin point to climb the trunk. She's obviously not happy. Who would be? She drinks this honey liquid fluid. And Leach describes the horror of what happens. The atrocious cannibal tree that has been so inert and dead suddenly came back to life, a savage life. As tendrils wrapped around and around her neck, through screams and gurgles and laughter, she is slowly strangled. You didn't expect this, did you? We were going to go here. It's botany, people. The Germans watch this happen and unfold. As the nectar in her blood begin to mix into a viscous, oozing mixture, everyone commences into an intoxicated orgy. Why not? The Germans just watch it, and Hendrik pulls him away, Leash away. Leash comes back 10 days later, and he finds that the leaves are open and there's only a skull left. When Edmund Spencer published this encounter, on Sunday, this was in the Sunday newspaper, On April 26, 1874, on the front cover of the New York World, people became panicked. Not only was this a savage plant, but of course the people were savages too. The story attracted much attention and continues to do so today, although the artist renditions get really, really weird. This was the Madagascar tree. It even had a scientific name, Crinoidea dagiana. This story got mileage, major mileage. In 1924, Chase Osborne, I don't know if anyone has heard of him, shout out for Chase, former governor. There's always one person who knows them, yeah? We got some people who are like, yeah. 1924, Chase Osborne, he's the former governor of Michigan, and he turned travel writer, traversed Madagascar and published his Madagascar, the Land of the Man-Eating Tree. It's really technically woman-eating tree, but we'll come back to that. Osborne said that missionaries had vouched for the tree's existence, and missionaries would never lie. So as this story takes on a life of its own, you find out pretty quickly that the tree itself doesn't exist. People still hunt for it. The Makoto never existed, including the very author of this piece, Edmund Spenser. None of it existed. It was considered one of the greatest literary hoax out there. But this story would not die out. And so the Madagascar tree had taken on this life of its own. Suddenly humans in Madagascar were put together in place with plants as being savage. This continued and still continues up until today. And at this began this very sort of long allure and dreamlike world of Madagascar as a place of the strange, the queer, the dangerous. I'm going to shift to 1889. We're going to leave Chase alone for a second. I wonder what he's doing now. The continent of Africa. Does everyone know where the continent of Africa is? Yeah, just checking. It becomes a veritable sweet store, and we all know of this, of natural resources and labour for European colonial ambitions. As the French colonial regime slowly wrestles control of the island from the Marine Kingdom, naturalists begin to explore the island. This is the beginning point for my project of when these two worlds begin to actually come about in Madagascar. The Englishman, Reverend Richard Barron, is the first Western person to make a map of the flora, and what he does is he divides this ginormous island. It's about the size of Texas, France, around there. He divides it into 3 floristic regions: Western, Eastern, and Central. He bases it on floristic criteria. Under French colonial rule, the French botanist Pierre de la Battie proposes a more refined classification. So this is the beginning of an ecology, sort of an ecologist's view of Madagascar. He splits it into 2 different kind of systems: indigenous vegetation, which is very diverse and found in very specific locations, and anthropogenic vegetation, remarkably poor in numbers of species but occupying large areas. It was Battie who introduced the Swiss botanist A.P. de Candole's concept of endemism, defined in this time as the distribution of an organism in a limited geographical area. Over the next 90 years, this kind of survey work would continue, and it continues today, creating layers of what will become known as ecosystems and ecoregions without questioning Barron's original division. From here, I'm just going to move through these slides pretty quickly that you can see. This is how Madagascar is reduced, and many places. So as Africa's being carved up, there's more and more categories and subcategories of botany and obviously zoology. Throughout the 20th century, finer scale models using GIS and other such technologies are produced. The latest one actually is over here on display. What you will notice in these pictures is that humans are not in this picture. Why would they? This is about plants. And so the model sort of represents this sort of original concept of Madagascar as being absent of people, which is very common under a colonial, regime. And so it shifts from being sort of this strange, unique, and rare landscape into something that has endemic species. And the concept of endemism is something I'm trying to follow in my work. Soon the French began to place botanical treasures under a bell jar. The first strict natural reserve was demarcated in in 1927, the Singi Reserve, with access strictly for scientists. So everyone that was there had to be removed, whether they wanted it or not. Here, and I won't have time to talk about it, but here a long history of conflict over issues of land use in Madagascar sort of begins and reveals that when you begin to kind of like scratch the surface, political control was situational and that rights to resources became more and more ambiguous. At the same time that Madagascar and other places of the world are being sort of carved up biologically, French culture permeated with sort of imagery of this like unusual, unknown world. People probably have read The Little Prince. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, and the absolutely phenomenal Baobab. So by the time we reach sort of the post-colonial period, ecology has professionalized, it is mathematized, it has become more and more a respected discipline itself. So what on earth has any of this got to do with the work that I'm doing here at the library? So we're going to go to the 1970s. Plants collected, as you well know, in places like Madagascar end up in a myriad of locations. In Paris, at Kew, in the Missouri Botanic Gardens, and here. What I'm interested in is that when you extract material from somewhere else and you bring it to a different location with different groups of people analyzing it, it's here where there's systems and theories and hypotheses and histories are interpreted. What happens when that goes back into a new space, okay? Here at the gardens, I've been working through a heap of archival material. There's so much here. I'm going to be leaving in March, but I might not leave at all. It is a White House, I suppose, but we won't talk about that. For this part, I'm going to focus on one internationally recognized leader that I know people know here, so I'm actually really excited to hear what you know about him, and that's Arthur Cronquist. Do people just want to talk about him? I'm like, because I'm so curious. So first of all, I'm going to show a slide that there's a lot on this slide. I'm just going to check my time. I don't expect you to read all this, but it's just to give you a sense of it. He was really opinionated. So I'm going through his correspondence, and there's tons and tons of just fascinating comments that I don't know what to do with, right? Because it's not directly what I'm looking at. At the time that he was here at the gardens in the 40s and 50s up to the 90s, the situation in systematic botany was pretty dire. Other types of botanists were questioning whether the loose, theory-free, intuitive approach being taken was scientific. Even systematists were not sure whether systematics was a science. We'll talk about whether that's still the case. With objective principles or an art acquired over many years of careful apprenticeship. Herbaria were in trouble in the 70s, many lost curatorial faculty, and a number were orphaned. The field was teetering on the brink of intellectual extinction. It was perceived as too lacking in rigorous methods and too loosely connected to evolutionary biology. Phylogenetics, the use of genes, the integration of genes into understanding the relationships between plants, was considered the thing that was going to save botany. And it did, on some level. Cronquist was kind of a little resistant to these changes. Does that surprise anybody here? Which is fascinating. I'm going to show a series of slides. They have a lot of text on them. I apologize for that. Actually, I don't, because you can just read them. He has the best descriptions of, I'm not going to get into anything to do with cladistics right now. And I can explain why in the question section. I just want to talk about some of the conversations he's having. You probably know of the evolution biologist Francisco Ayala. Some of you know him. And so this is one of his letters, and again, it's so long, but it's so interesting. So Cronquist writes to him, and Ayala has sent him some of his reprints of his own work. And he says, in your paper on protein evolution in different species, is it a random process? I wonder if you have not been misled by that unfortunate term, random mutation. Mutation is, of course, at random in the sense that we can neither control nor predict what will happen next, but it is anything but at random in the mathematical sense of any one thing, being as likely as the other. As long ago as 1941, our mutual friend Dobzhansky, that's Theodosius Dobzhansky, amazing evolutionary biologist, points out in his textbook that mutability is under partial genetic control. Therefore, we might reasonably expect some degree of channeling in evolutionary changes of proteins, even if these changes are selectively neutral. Maybe you will still come up with the same answer, but it might not be worth your while to address this matter next time around. I told you I was going to get obscure. You were warned. Ayala writes back. I'm just going to read a piece of this. Be that as it may, the meaning that is evolutionary most important is that mutations are random with respect to adaptation. The probability that a given mutant will arise in a given environment, that can be perhaps more explicitly stated by saying that the mutation process is unoriented with respect to adaptation. It's very hard to read the end of it and figure out what he means. My paper assumes that these assumptions and conclusions of the theory are known to the reader. It's hard to know if this is a burn or not towards Cronquist, but it certainly seems it. As we move on, because Cronquist ends up being this gatekeeper to so much information, he's so much correspondence, the conversation gets much broader, and I can't actually cover all of the stuff that he's trying to grapple with. But he's not particularly happy with where it's going. This is from Lois Arno out in Utah. He basically is trying to grapple with Doug Dewey's recent publication. And he says, I will give him an A for effort, but no more than a C for taxonomic performance. One of my grad students has transformed, this is a different botanist, god-awful flush key into an indented key, which I pass on to you for whatever value you may find in it. It is clear enough that generic lines, in this case of the Trichaceae family, need drastic revision, but I can't see splitting things as finely as Doug and Askell, other botanists, want to. It seems absurd to me to put the plants we've called Agrippyron smithii and Agrippium, how do you say that one? That one's a hard one. There's too many H's in it for me. Into different genera. Those two species have been entirely too friendly to belong in different genera. I suspect that what has been called a smithii variety mull is at least in part a result of hybridization between them. I encourage genome analysis as a source of information, but the taxonomic system should be a general purpose system based on all the available evidence. Special purpose systems based on a limited kind of evidence will have only limited usefulness. The taxonomist's job is to take care of everyone, not just an interest group. As this goes on, and I will stop reading them, he has more and more and more of these letters that establish that what's going on with the use of chloroplasts is beyond the pale. This is not helpful. And it really gets back to one thing that Cronquist is all about, or at least in the letters that I can ascertain. He wants people to be able to access botany. He feels that if you go into the lab, it becomes more obscure. People become much more like niche, pun intended, right? And that really upsets him. Accessibility is a thing, even though he feels he's also the gatekeeper to that. His own views on sort of taxonomic changes over time and looking at sort of the history of plants, he sort of had a view that taxonomic changes were sort of taxa were primitive, and others as derived progressively along adaptive lines. His tendency was to extend the map metaphor, which was way back in the 19th century, and to link it up to extant sort of taxa in a ladder-like series. So he definitely was much more sort of what you would call traditional or old school in that thinking. But for Cronquist, and this is a key point that I hope I can make, is that for Cronquist endemism was really important, but he didn't put it in those terms. The work he did on the floor of North America, he was all about trying to delimit the spaces where things were and keep them that way. But molecular genetics, as you well know, went off on its own route, and I can talk more about that in the questions. What I'm grappling with at the moment is, by the time you reach the 1990s, that molecular biology itself has sort of come into its own. It's around this time that you see in this sort of post-colonial and decolonial period of time, you see that people are like moving. There's more migration of people. There's more destruction to land. We all know this. And so in the 1990s, there was a suggestion that we would use phylogenetic diversity to figure out what to keep. And what I'm trying to figure out at the moment, and you can see that this is a very unwieldy project at the moment, is that for a lot of evolution biologists, endemism, in terms of the ecological way of thinking about it, is an evolutionary dead end. Natural selection has already pruned the tree. So if you think about something like a baobab, it's in its location in Madagascar. For a lot of them, the debates are why would we save that species, right? In theory, you're saving evolutionary time, but are you? So I'm kind of grappling with that at the moment. And just before I finish, because I'm sure I am over time, Vanessa?
You have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Okay, 3 more minutes. Okay, so one thing I want to say is that this project at the moment is extremely biased towards Western science. That is not where I want my project to go. What I'm trying to do is find the knowledge systems of the Malagasy here, okay? And that's where I'm going to be going next year and take on that, because that's what I really want to try and understand. So I just want to put a shout out. This is very white. It's very white, this story. And that's not. I don't want the Malagasy as a supporting cast, because that's how they've always been treated. So that's not what I'm interested in. The other thing is, as I shifted from science into history, so this is really exciting for me, and I've got 3 minutes, maybe 2.5 minutes to talk about it. A lot of these people that I'm talking about are still alive, and there's probably people in this audience that eventually I will write about. And so as someone who's moving into history, what's really hard to wrap my brain around is when someone's dead, you can kind of say what you want about them in theory, right? But when they're alive or people know them, it's this very fragile space to be in. And the reason I bring this up is because I was going through all the grants, all the NSF grants that Cronquist was writing. And you can see around the 50s and 60s there's a shift in the way he characterizes his work. And this was very common for Peter Raven, for a whole bunch of other sort of botanists at this time, that there's a shift from saying we need to inventory the world to conserve the world. And on one of these grants, I found a man that I really just want to talk about, and this is what the racy picture might come up right now, is Sherwin Carlquist, which I'm sure some people know here. Sherwin Carlquist is 89 years of age. He's a botanist. He worked in California, and he isn't just a botanist, he's also a photographer. So there is a picture coming up. It's of a semi-naked man, I hope. So this is content warning. He's not totally naked. He's naked from the top up. This is not the naked man, just to let you know. So this is something I'm trying to grapple with, is that I'm interested in the legacy of collections as they move through time and space and location to today. I'm also interested in, Dr. Carlquist is 89 years of age, and I've been emailing him back and forth and discovered I didn't know he had this other side to him, right? He has 10 of these books that for some people they would be considered porn, for other people they would be considered art, but they're part of who he is. He is a very proud gay man. This is something that was well known. And so I'm trying to grapple with how do you actually put this into the story, right? And capture his side. Because he emailed me and said that his legacy is in my hands. Now, what do you do with that, right? I'm just okay, I'm going to defriend him. So it is something that I'm grappling with. And the other thing that I'm grappling with, and I'll throw this out and then I promise I'll be quiet, is that plants themselves, when you look at the history of modern biology, you all know that plants themselves are considered outliers. They don't fit into these very neat, nice categories. And so what I'm trying to look at is, botany is this very queer discipline, right? We say male and female, but really they're not. Plants are super plastic and flexible. They do things that it just astounds us, and the things we don't understand. So what I'm trying to do is try and understand why botany itself was actually rejected from the modern synthesis. So that's another thread that I'm trying to actually piece into this wieldy work. I will be quiet there. Will I leave this up? This is one of the better pictures. And if anyone wants to see it, I've got one of the books on my desk, always open. Feel free to come by. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuala.
Sorry, I'm way over time.
Please stay here, and would you also join
Yes.
Nuala for some questions?
Share this
Who has a
podium
question?
with you?
Yeah.
I have one for Kim.
Yeah.
Have you had any like Citizen Science Notes for Nature to digitize like thousands of records?
And please repeat the question so everybody can hear.
Yeah, can you ask it again?
Have you integrated any like citizen science efforts or Notes from Nature to try and process all the backlog of catalogs?
Oh, yeah. No, but I'd like to. And actually, I want to. Sorry, the question was, yes. Have I used any of the citizen science to source some of the information? A lot of the catalogs are digitized now. I'm trying to figure out if there's a clean way that I can actually get the text from those, but the way that they're sort of buried in there. I mean, maybe I like talk to the digitized people here and we can talk about that. But I would love to do a quick read because it's a lot faster to just say everything that's on biodiversity right now that has the word northern spy in it from this year to this year. Let's just pull that up and let's save me like a lot of time. And we can do that with a lot of plants very quickly. I have not done that yet, but perhaps an appointment shall be set soon. Yeah.
So, it seems like apples, for whatever reason, are sort of always associated with goodness, an apple a day and so forth. I mean, what's the origin of that? You talk about nurseries as being wholesome, but apples in particular seem to, always be associated with sort of goodness and health.
Yeah, what's up with apples? That's a great, sort of the cultural reality of apples. It's at least in American context. I mean, it's complicated too because it's got religious elements too, which you would think are not necessarily in its favor. The way that the apple sort of gets appropriated as the fruit. But it's definitely a New England thing, which in the 19th century culturally would have been sort of what was seen as the most American. I'm going to throw that out there, but pick some fighting. And in moving westward, it was mostly immigrant populations, but also New Englanders who are moving west. And so, those maps move quickly, but you can see there's not a lot of apple trees in the South at that time, which is also the South, at least leading up to the Civil War, is focused on other crops with other labor, slavery. But the apple is an essential part of the farm as well, in the sense that you would not be encouraged to drink water from open water sources because you might die if you get a disease. So the cider from apple is actually a staple of the farm household as an actual safe beverage to drink. So that's also a part of that legacy as well. Yeah.
My question is for Camden. I thought you did a great job of explaining the positives of all the nurseries and
Yeah.
everything like
Yeah.
that. But I was thinking about maybe some of the negatives, in particular invasive species and how that might have negative consequences.
Absolutely.
during their time.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yeah, so bad guys. No, or like the negative ecological effects. I moved through this quickly. I have a whole chapter on that called bugs. But essentially, these are also the biggest agents of spreading malicious pests. And there's a lot of legislation at the end of the 20th century. After a lot of this plant material has moved west and it's sort of hit the end, and all the nurseries out west mostly have a lot of the plants that they have out east, they're like, let's shut down this plant trade now because farmers are losing crops to the pests that are seen to be spread by nurserymen. And you start to see a wave of quarantine laws that are meant to shut this down. And it's really interesting, you get these letters. There's a lot of debates about how to pack plant trees. If you plant them in hay or straw, you're going to get mice. And then the mice will just gnaw on the plants. Now you've got mice that are being delivered somewhere that someone didn't want mice, and they've lost the plants. And in the 19th century law, it's buyer beware. There's no reimbursement on lost material there. And so, the San Jose scale, I've got a whole chapter. Maybe we'll do another talk or something. But yeah, like bugs ruin the entire trade and will lead to the downfall of sort of these huge plant nurseries. And then you start to have just regional ones that are servicing local environments.
So, first, just an observation on crop list. Many a lunch, I ate lunches with all of us many times. I think what he did, what made him distrust people maybe was, or It wasn't so much whether they did molecular systematics or not. I think that he felt that they needed first to be sort of grounded in actually practical ability to recognize one plant from another. And I think that's something that still persists among a lot of us, that you sense that the idea that you could just shortcut the process of getting to know the organisms in the field, being able to identify them, being able to characterize them, that there was just some magic way with molecules, or before molecules it was whatever, allozymes or secondary compounds. That seems sort of like cheating.
Yeah.
And brash people who suddenly have new conclusions that are based just on chemicals and test tubes rather than the hard work. I think that was probably the divide. And so you could, if you were a field botanist who did molecular systematics and used that in your work, that was probably fine with him. It was just that if you were some fresh, person who thought there was a way to shortcut the process. So there's a lot of elements in there. I'm not saying right or wrong, but it's the idea of paying your dues and But I'm curious what about, just I'd like you to clarify what you said about botany being left out of the modern synthesis. What do you mean by that?
So,
Fighting words.
fighting words.
Question?
So you're asking me,
I'd just like to know what you mean.
what I mean by the fact that botany was sort of excluded from the modern synthesis. So I assume people know what the modern synthesis is?
Not quite.
Not quite, okay. So the modern synthesis is that moment in the 1930s and 40s when the work that was done on genetics begins to actually bind together into a single framework with evolutionary theory. So up until that point, so much was up for grabs, right? So you think about Ernst Mayr and Dobzhansky's work, and basically, I have to put this very, very politely, basically the way that framework works is that by 1900, William Trelease, who was the director of the Missouri Botanic Gardens that you may have heard of, if you know of that place, he pretty much said the problem with botanists is that they don't have a species concept. And by 1900, he said we have to stop all our work because we're all over the place with this species concept. Now, zoologists began to have a very set species concept, one that's still used today. It's problematic, but they came together and sort of there was consensus to use the biological species concept, right? You've got male and female, you've got groups of things that can mate together, and if they're viable offspring, they're a species, right? We still kind of work with that, and botanists work that. But if you begin to actually scratch the surface of that, what was happening was that to bring genetics in, you had to actually sort of tame the genes. You had to like figure out that the variation was of a very particular type. And then you took sort of theory and you mashed that together. And so the modern synthesis had to exclude botany because botany was too plastic. So when you look at the book that was written, it's escaping my name, Modern Systematics, that Julian Huxley wrote the intro to, if you look at that book and you look at the chapters of that, they don't say the word zoology, but they do say the word botany, and Sewell Wright wrote about it. And so if you read that chapter, what it's saying is the whole book is actually a book about zoology. And so no one has really ever questioned that claim. Today you have the extended modern synthesis that's going on, where you have people working on things like microorganisms and plants that are much more plastic and fluid and do all sorts of things, as you well know, horizontal gene flow and all this good stuff. And they're actually trying to push to actually extend this. So that's what I meant by that. The other thing about botany being excluded was, and this is pure speculation at this point, but just I'm beginning to sort of see a trend, is that botany becomes super feminized. And what I mean by that is the actual discipline itself, because it wasn't able to actually go into sort of hardcore theory, and I'm talking now about the 1920s and 30s, it was dominated by women. It was clearly dominated by gay men, and probably gay women as well. And so there's another story there that I'm trying to grapple with as well. You probably know of a very famous, I won't say anything because I don't want to out someone, but there is a botanist that was like in the 1930s, was gay, and everyone knew he was gay, and he was kicked out of a very famous museum because he was homosexual. So I'm trying to uncover that. There's something that's why I say use the word queer. There's something very, very plastic about it. Does that make sense? You're pondering?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Yeah, yeah.
What was interesting about all this Cronquist correspondence, we had been led to believe that Cronquist himself destroyed all his correspondence.
Who led you to believe that?
I'm serious.
Yeah, no, tell me where does that information come from?
Just
A general?
word of mouth around among the science staff.
Well, you mean what he received, not what he sent.
I think in general, we were told that he actually destroyed his correspondence and had his secretary destroy it.
I mean, it's hard to describe what he sent.
Well, that's true, I mean, but how would we have gotten copies from, across the world? That becomes possible, but I assume in many cases it was probably a carbon or something that he sent, I don't know. But
Yeah, so I can't answer that question because I'm not sure, but a lot of the letters I have here, they are the ones that he was receiving, but there are carbon copies of what he sent out. And he'll refer to, I'm replying to this letter, so I can actually match them up, yeah. But that's very interesting. I wonder it was his own private letters. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'll definitely think about it.
We have, that is what we've been told. And maybe he destroyed some,
Yeah,
and whoever spread this rumor thought it was the whole thing.
yeah.
It may be that it didn't go to the library, the boxes people were expecting somehow, and that's how the conclusion, but that certainly is what we've always been led to believe.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we happen enough have some left. The secretary maybe didn't do a good job.
Don't blame the woman.
Okay, this is another question for Nuala. I enjoyed both of your presentations very much. Thank you. Last year, the Wall Street Journal published an article about plant blindness, and they
Yeah.
didn't invent the term, and they were only publicizing a concept that
Yeah.
has now become much more well-known. But it basically discusses the separation, disconnect that people have with plants.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you are researching how this modern synthesis, maybe this obsession with genes, has contributed to people not being able to understand the complexity of plants because it is too complex. And that perhaps what Cronquist was getting at was that we have a danger of leading people down this very complex road that they will lose their connection to plants. And if you think that the plant blindness that we have today is perhaps been exacerbated by the obsession with what we can't see.
That's like a really good point. So just to your point as well, to connect them both, that sort of idea of tacit knowledge that you had to actually kind of physically be there with the plants, whether it was in the field or in a herbarium, was really important to him. And you can see in his correspondence to grad students where he's like scolding them for choosing two things, and he's like, there's 200 of these things that you need to look at. Definitely the molecular end of it is huge because that's where most of the funding goes right now. Plant blindness came out in the BSA article. I can't remember who coined the concept. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this project, which I know seems like in many pieces, is that the sort of the historiography, like the history of this discipline of botany, is not very. There's lots of beautiful books out there, but the actual what's going on with the scientists is not really talked about. The last book that really talked about systematics is David Hull's book, which some of you may know, which is Science as a Process. That book really kind of did so much damage to taxonomists because he sort of gets into the nitty gritty, and people, sort of historians, are very much averse to actually looking at how data moves and how it's constructed. Plant blindness to me is fascinating. There's so much sort of what I'm describing as zoo chauvinism in the world. You all know what it's like. It's really hard to make people get super excited about a cuddly orchid. It's like the charismatic species, and this has always been the battle, and that's why the modern synthesis is part of this battle. So yeah, I'm totally on board in trying to figure out that puzzle. And what are the implications in choosing molecular genetics today and conservation measures? It's slowly moving into the plant world so that you're going to pick candidate species. So we can talk more because I feel like I'm going to wander off.
Thank you all for coming to our theme this morning, Malus to Madagascar. And we continue the conversation here with the rare specimen as well as historical materials drawn from the various collections at the Botanical Garden. Please take a peek. Thank you all for coming.